Before there was a Lake Marion or Lake Moultrie, there was an idea, a dream to connect two of South Carolina's greatest rivers, the Santee and the Cooper, to reach the port of Charleston. Back in 1770, the Commons House of Assembly in Charleston formed a committee to explore just that. They hired a surveyor named Henry Mouzon to chart the land between the rivers and find a possible route. By 1775, Mouzon had identified 5 paths that might work, but before anyone could start digging, the Revolutionary War began. If you're a Hamilton fan, this was the era of Yorktown, the moment in 1781 when, as the song says, the world turned upside down. The British defeat there signaled that the war's end was finally in sight. When the fighting eased, the Jackson Borough Assembly convened in 1782, while British troops still occupied Charleston. It was one of the most important meetings in South Carolina's early history, a moment when leaders sought to rebuild civil government, address confiscated Loyalist estates, and plan for recovery. In that same spirit of renewal, they revived an old idea, connecting the Santee and Cooper Rivers to open a direct route to the port of Charleston. Fast forward a few years. In 1785, a group of Charleston citizens petitioned the Assembly for a charter to finally turn that dream into reality. The following year, lawmakers approved it, and the Company for the Inland Navigation between the Santee and Cooper Rivers was born. Leading the project were some of the most prominent names in South Carolina's history: General William Moultrie, Governor John Rutledge, Brigadier General Francis Marion, known as the Swamp Fox, and the Brigadier General Thomas Sumter, called the Carolina Gamecock. They hired a Swedish engineer, Colonel John Christian Smith, who had served under Sumter during the war. But the work ahead of them was grueling, and the swampland unforgiving. More than 1,000 laborers took on the job, armed with little more than picks, shovels, and wheelbarrows. White workers often avoided the site in the summer heat, leaving the hardest, most dangerous labor to the enslaved. Construction began in 1793 and wasn't finished until 1800. When it finally opened, the Santee Canal stretched 22 miles long, linking White Oak Landing on the Santee River to Biggin Creek on the Cooper. The cost was more than $650,000 and was celebrated as a marvel of early American engineering. For a time, barges floated through its narrow waters, carrying cotton, tobacco, rice, and goods from the interior straight to Charleston's busy port, a faster, safer route than the treacherous coastal voyage. But the celebration didn't last. Droughts dried up sections of the canal. Its design proved flawed. And by the 1840s, railroads offered quicker, cheaper transport. By the 1850s, the canal was abandoned, its water still, its promise unfulfilled. A century later, that dream resurfaced, this time on a much larger scale. The 1930s brought a new kind of crisis, the Great Depression. Across the country, families struggled to eat, work, and survive. President Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal promised hope of jobs, public works, and progress. But behind that promise was a belief that America could rebuild itself, not just by fixing banks, but by reshaping the land itself. I want to start with someone who knows this landscape well. Historian Dr. Robert Hart has roots in the region and studies how the New Deal transformed life across South Carolina.
Yes, I'm Dr. Robert Hart, and I teach at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. I'm originally from Holly Hill, South Carolina. It's near Lake Marion, would be the closest landmark in terms of our discussion of the Santee Cooper Lakes.
Which is perfect to lead us into this question. So could you start by explaining how the New Deal and progressive political thought shaped the creation of large-scale projects like this one in South Carolina?
I could. I guess, the best way to explain it is the New Deal was a set of programs created or initiated by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt when he took office in 1933 that were designed really to pull the nation out of the Great Depression by stabilizing the nation's economy and providing emergency relief, as well as putting people back to work on projects that would overhaul the nation's infrastructure. And just to kind of preface that, when Roosevelt takes office, it's 3 years after the Depression starts. And so you've got this, not only has the stock market crashed, but banks have closed, people have lost their savings, unemployment nationally was at 23%, but it was higher in many industrial cities. People were losing their homes and farms. Homelessness was on the rise. People were living in those infamous Hoovervilles that you often see pictures of. And in South Carolina, specifically, income had fallen nearly 40% per capita. Half of the state's banks had closed by 1933, and cotton prices, which was one of our major commodities, was at 5 cents a pound. Some people were getting even less than that. So people needed help fast, and Roosevelt's programs were designed to provide that.
In South Carolina, that vision took the form of the Santee Cooper Project, a massive New Deal effort that aimed to connect rivers, generate electricity, and bring jobs to struggling communities.
One of the reasons why he focused on public works projects was that by employing people on infrastructure projects, it would provide them with jobs, which would give them money so that they could spend that and revitalize or begin to restart the economy from the bottom up rather than trickling down from the top. The other was he believed firmly that if you put people to work rather than simply on relief, that it would provide them with increased morale, that it was good for people to have jobs and to work for the money they were receiving because they would have pride in what they were doing. And then finally, one of the reasons why he emphasized public works projects is because they were visible. So people could actually see the building of roads. They could see people building bridges. They could see people building dams. These were tangible, they were visible, and they demonstrated that the government was actually doing something to solve the problems that Americans were facing. And it also, was designed to restore faith in Americans' ability to build and to engineer their way out of the financial crisis that they were in. And this is the context in which the Santee Cooper project really falls. Roosevelt was a firm believer in dams and the ability to use natural resources for the maximum benefit of the American people. He believed in kind of an older strand that came out of the progressive era of not allowing, this was only one strand that came out of progressive era thinking, and that was, not allowing natural resources simply to sit idle for the sake of preservation. There were many who believed in that. Roosevelt was not necessarily one of them. Not to allow natural resources to be exploited by corporations for profit, but rather to utilize those natural resources to the maximum advantage of the American people.
South Carolina already had a long history of dam building, from Lake Wateree in 1919 to Lake Murray in 1930, but the Depression accelerated that push. By the 1940s, nearly every major river in the state had been dammed. Lake Marion, completed in 1942, became South Carolina's largest, spanning more than 110,000 acres of water and possibility. But this story isn't only engineering, it's people. Historian Dr. Kelsey Moore studies African American life and environmental change in the Lowcountry and what the lakes meant for everyday survival, faith, and place.
Hi, I'm Dr. Kelsey Alejandra Moore. I'm an assistant professor of African American history and Black studies at Georgetown University. Santee Cooper is a part of this larger quest or interest in the federal government's desire to build dams, and because this has been true all across the country. What I think historians call it the big dam era, because we know you have dams being built out in the West. I think Grand Coulee Dam is being built, but the Santee Cooper project is actually bigger than that. I think maybe the most popular one in the South is TVA, but I think Santee Cooper was also bigger than TVA. So it just, again, hydroelectric energy was in vogue. This was a perfect opportunity for white legislatures in, South Carolina to carry out what they thought was going to be a plan for economic development, getting rid of swamps, bringing electricity, quite literally, as they would put it, bringing people out of darkness. That was a part of that. And also, I do want to say it's funny because South Carolina has already had a long history of dam building. I shouldn't say a long history, but there's no lake in South Carolina that is real. All of them are man-made. Lake Murray is man-made. There's a few other lakes that were constructed in the early 1900s. And then after the Santee Cooper project, during the 1950s and throughout the 70s, a lot of lakes were created in order to serve as like cooling systems for nuclear power. So I think the Santee Cooper project really sits at this like nexus between early dam building or hydroelectric projects in the state, but then this later period for nuclear energy, because the Santee Cooper project by the end is declared a defense project in 1941 because they needed the energy for the war effort. And that's kind of a lead in into like, we enter into a Cold War, or what they call the Cold War, right after World War II. And so I think like the Santee Cooper just sits at this like perfect part of this history, of this longer history. I'm straying from the point, but
No, but I think that's interesting because the things that are happening at this point in time, at the beginning of them creating this project, I mean, it doesn't just stop. It just, like you're saying, it evolves into something
right.
more. Thinking about like nuclear plants and, like you said, cooling areas. The idea that there were no natural formed lakes in South Carolina, it just, I'm in awe of that because I just assumed, like you just assume it's a natural resource. So, or you at least you think it's a natural resource, and really it's a man-made resource.
The river systems are very, real. That is like what it is natural. South Carolina has a very interesting river system, and that is what they're trying to manipulate. They're trying to, manipulate that water source to do other things for them, and in the hopes of what they consider progress.
In 1927, the Great Mississippi Flood devastated 10 states, displacing more than 600,000 people. For FDR, floods like this symbolized both disaster and potential, a call to control nature for the good of the people. He believed rivers could be tamed and used, not left idle for preservation, but harnessed for power, navigation, and renewal.
He really loved dams because, in the 1920s, there had been a series of disastrous floods on the Ohio River, on the Tennessee River, most significantly on the Mississippi River in 1927. That came at a terrible cost to human life and property. And Roosevelt, and many other people like Roosevelt, believed that if you could just tame those rivers, control those rivers, you could do several things. One is that you could prevent flooding and therefore reduce the cost to human life and property loss. The other was that you could use that water that was seemingly, in his mind, being wasted during these flood events to generate hydroelectric power, which could then drive regional development. And then by controlling rivers, taming them, so to speak, and ensuring or regulating the water levels, you could improve inland navigation, which would allow for commercial traffic on America's rivers. This was the idea behind the Tennessee Valley Authority, which most people recognize if they've never heard of the Santee Cooper project. And the idea behind that was to harness the power of the Tennessee River to modernize the Tennessee Valley. That was one of the more impoverished regions of Lower Appalachia. So this was also the idea behind the Santee Cooper project, which was often known as South Carolina's Little TVA. And once again, the idea behind it was to control flooding. It was to promote inland navigation from Columbia to Charleston by connecting the Santee and the Cooper Rivers. And then it was to generate electricity through hydropower, which would then modernize rural South Carolina, which is why it was often called by its supporters the 3-in-1 project, flood control, navigation, and electricity. But it was really the Depression and the New Deal that provided both the funding and also the justification, because people needed jobs. You know, I mentioned the financial straits that South Carolina was in. And politicians, primarily Mayor Burnett Maybank of Charleston, who in 1938 became governor, largely on his work to promote and get the Santee Cooper project up and running, Senator James F. Burns of South Carolina, and then State Senator Richard Jeffries all promoted this project. And they justified it a couple of ways. One is they really believed that this project was going to revive Charleston's economy. And by reviving Charleston's economy, it would create in South Carolina a booming port that would rival or surpass other ports on the East Coast. The other justification, though, was that by producing inexpensive power, they would lure industry to relocate to Berkeley County and the surrounding areas, Lower Orangeburg County, Clarendon County, those areas near the lakes, and that would provide non-agricultural jobs, manufacturing jobs primarily, for rural residents who were struggling on farms to make ends meet. And it was this kind of industrial renaissance that they promoted that was one of their major selling points for people outside of Charleston.
How did they justify that dream to basically everyone at the time? I mean, it sounds like a really good thing, right? To have a 3-in-1 project during this time that would bring electricity and progress to the state. I have to ask, was it successful?
Well, it was successful in a way, but it also had negative consequences. So to come back to that original part of your question about how did they justify this to the public, this was not necessarily a new idea, connecting the two rivers. The Santee Canal, built just after the American Revolution during the 1780s and completed in the 1790s, was the initial project that connected the Santee and Cooper River. And it lasted for about 50 years, fell into disrepair, and then was essentially, it became obsolete due to railroads and other forms of transportation. It was revived again in the late 19th century, faced a lot of opposition. People had the same questions. Why would we do that? Is it really worth it? T.C. Williams from Columbia has this idea in the 1920s and gets a license to generate electricity, never comes up with the funding, loses his shirt in the stock market crash.
If you've been following along our Lake Murray episodes, that name might sound familiar. When Dr. Hart mentions T.C. Williams, he's talking about one of the driving forces behind the creation of Lake Murray. And he didn't work alone. Williams partnered with Columbia businessman Gabriel Ginyard through the Columbia Railway Navigation Company, a group that turned an ambitious river plan into South Carolina's first great hydroelectric project. By 1925, the Marion Flood Engineering Report had laid out the design, and on April 2nd, 1926, the Federal Power Commission granted the company a 50-year lease just months before Ginyard's death that July. Their work on Lake Murray not only transformed the Midlands, but also set the blueprint for what came next, the Santee Cooper Project and the lakes that would reshape the Lowcountry. The Santee Cooper Project became one of the largest public works projects in South Carolina history, a partnership between federal and state governments to create power, jobs, and a path to prosperity. Governor Burnett Maybank, Senator J.F. Barnes, and State Senator Richard Jeffries envisioned the project as a way to revive Charleston and the state's economy. They promised affordable electricity that would attract new industry, create jobs, and bring light to rural communities long left in darkness.
Recovery programs allowed for there to be a pot of cash hanging around. And all that the South Carolina state legislation had to do was create what they call a public authority, which is kind of like this quasi-private, also public entity that allowed the federal government to give it money so it could administer the project.
The promise of electricity changed everything. In 1936, the Rural Electrification Act funded cooperatives that brought light to farms and small towns across America.
The Santee Cooper Project and as a whole fits into this idea of progress because it is also connected to other FDR plans like the Rural Electrification Act of 1935, I believe. And that was to bring electricity to rural areas across the country. And even though we know like the Santee Cooper Project, it used hydroelectric energy to create electricity. What the Rural Electrification Act does is to bring power lines and transmission.
You know, and it's often hard for us to kind of think back to a time when people didn't have electricity. But, you know, so much of the nation in the teens and the 1920s was completely transformed by electricity, not only by lights, but by early refrigerators and ice boxes, irons. You know, 97% of people who had electricity in America in the 1920s bought irons. You know, they were tired of having wrinkly clothes, but they bought washing machines. You know, there's those little things that save people a lot of labor. You know, vacuum cleaners, for instance, indoor plumbing, which was better. Not only was it more convenient, but it was better for health. And so people in towns and in cities, not everybody in cities, there were still impoverished people in cities, their quality of life was dramatically different. And people in many rural areas, particularly in the South, were still living fundamentally the same way they had 50 years in the past. And so there was a greater gap between what people then perceived as modernization or the quality of life between those people that had electricity and access to all of the things that came with electricity and those people that didn't. And so bringing, as Santee Cooper would later say, bringing people out of the darkness because lights, you know, were so much a symbol of what electricity provided, became, you know, one of the selling points. When the proponents of the Santee Cooper Project really talked about modernization and what this would do beyond just the economic benefits, you know, and encouraging a higher standard of living.
The canal that once promised connection was reborn as a network of lakes and dams, the foundation of modern South Carolina. It brought jobs, electricity, and pride, but also erased communities that had stood for generations. In our next episode, we'll move from construction to community, exploring how farmers, churches, and families adopted to new waterscapes. We'll look at how faith and land shaped life before and after the flood. I'll see you next Thursday. You've been listening to Made in Carolina, created, produced, and hosted by me, Loli Terrell. Please like, click, and share if you love this podcast, featuring interviews with Dr. Hart, And Dr. Kelsey Moore, I thank you for your insights. Original music by Sister Sai, additional sound effects from freesound.org, website by Tiffany Macer Bass. Visit madeincarolinapodcast.com for show notes and more stories waiting under the water.